She was sold on a Tuesday. Not her body, her future. And every single person in that town watched it happen without saying a word. Black Ridge called itself a frontier town, but what it really was a place where fear had been so well fed for so long that people had forgotten what it felt like to be full of anything else. When the syndicate put Clara Whitmore on that platform, they weren't just selling off a dead man's debts. They were sending a message to every family in the valley. No one is untouchable. No one. The crowd stood there with their eyes down and their mouths shut, and the bidding began. But nobody told them what was coming through the dust at the edge of town. If this kind of story moves you, hit that like, leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning they auctioned Clara Whitmore's life away, the sky over Black Ridge was the color of an old bruise, that particular shade of purple-gray that shows up just before a storm decides it means business. It was barely past 8 o'clock. The summer heat was already pressing down on the valley like a hand on the back of a neck. Clara had been awake since before the sun came up. Not because she couldn't sleep, though that was true, but because she'd wanted to be awake. She'd wanted to be looking straight ahead when they came for her, not dragged out of a cot half-blind with her hair in her face. Whatever they were going to do to her, she was going to watch them do it. She'd spent the night in the back room of Harding's dry goods store, which was where they put people when the syndicate had a formal claim on them and didn't want any trouble before the proceedings. There was a cot, a bucket, and a small square window that looked out onto the alley between the store and the tannery. The smell coming through that window was not pleasant. Clara sat on the cot with her back straight and her hands in her lap and watched the sky go from black to gray to that ugly bruised color, and she thought about her father. Edmund Whitmore had not been a careful man. That was the truth of it, and Clara had known it most of her life. Had watched him sign papers without reading them all the way through, shake hands with men whose eyes she didn't like, convince himself every season that this year the rain would come, the yield would be better, the debt would be manageable. He'd had the farmer's particular brand of optimism, the kind that keeps going long past the point where any sensible person would have stopped. She'd loved him for it, even when it drove her half out of her mind. He'd been dead 3 weeks. He'd gone in his sleep, which was more than most men got out here. Clara had been the one to find him, had sat with him for a while in the quiet of the house before she went to tell anyone, just to have that time with him undisturbed. She hadn't cried much. She'd had too much to do. What she hadn't known, what Edmund had not told her, had maybe been unable to tell her, was how deep the hole went. The Whitmore place sat on 43 acres of decent grazing land on the eastern edge of the valley, with a creek running through the lower pasture that never quite dried up even in the worst summers. That creek was the reason Silas Voss wanted the land. That creek was the reason Edmund Whitmore's debts had been bought up, one by one over 2 years, by a holding company with a complicated name that nobody in Black Ridge was supposed to connect to Voss himself. The debt had been called in the morning after Edmund's burial. Clara had still had the smell of grave dirt on her hands when the papers arrived. The knock at the door of Harding's back room came around 7:30. It was Deputy Farwell, who had the uncomfortable look of a man who knows he's doing something wrong, but has talked himself into believing he has no choice. Miss Whitmore. He couldn't quite meet her eyes. It's time. Clara stood up. She'd slept in her clothes, a dark blue cotton dress that had been her mother's, taken in twice over the years as Clara had filled out in ways her slender mother never had. Clara was not her mother's kind of woman. She was broad through the shoulders and heavy in the hip, with hands roughened from years of fencing and hauling and the 100 other kinds of work a farm demanded. Her face was plain in the way that outdoor living makes faces plain. Sun-browned, strong-boned, with dark circles under eyes that were too steady for comfort. She had never in her life been described as pretty. She had, on more than one occasion, been described as unsettling. She picked up her hat from the cot and put it on. "Let's go then," she said. Farwell looked almost pained. "Miss Whitmore, I want you to know that this isn't—" "I know what it is," Clara said. "Let's go." But the platform had been set up in the open square in front of the land office, which was where the syndicate liked to conduct its formal business. It was a practical choice. The land office steps were wide and visible from most of the main street, and the square itself could hold a crowd of a couple hundred without anyone being more than 40 feet from the action. Silas Voss had a sense for theater. He understood that half the value of a public proceeding like this one was the watching of it. You needed people to see, and they had come to see. Clara counted maybe 60, 70 people as Farwell walked her across the square, ranchers and their wives, storekeepers, a few of the rougher men who drifted through Black Ridge without ever seeming to leave. Children had been kept home mostly. Even the people who had accepted what the valley had become under Voss's influence understood that this particular morning was not for children. They were quiet. That was the thing that Clara would remember later, in the long nights after. Not the faces, not the heat, but the silence. Nobody called out. Nobody said her name. A few of them looked away when she passed. Most just watched with that flat, carefully neutral expression that people wear when they've decided that witness is safe, but involvement is not. Clara had grown up among these people. She'd helped bring in harvests with some of them, shared meals with others, sat up through difficult nights in the way frontier neighbors sometimes had to. She recognized the Belmont girls watching from in front of the feed store. She'd taught the elder one to read 6 years ago when the school was closed for a winter. She recognized old Pass Drummond, who'd come to her father every spring to borrow a good draft horse, and had always come back with something: a pie, a bottle, a sheaf of firewood. He was looking at his boots now. Clara didn't hate them for it. She understood it. That didn't make it feel any better. The platform was maybe 3 feet off the ground, just enough height to be visible to the whole square. There was a podium on it, and behind the podium stood 2 of Voss's men, Kern and a younger one they called Briggs, both of them wearing the look of men who are comfortable with unpleasant work. On the far side of the platform stood Silas Voss himself. Voss was not what you'd expect if you heard his name before you saw him. He was not a large man, not physically imposing in any obvious way. He was 50-something, lean and well-dressed, with a carefully trimmed gray beard and the kind of patient, settled expression that came from years of getting what he wanted without needing to raise his voice. He had the manner of a man who found confrontation slightly tiresome, not because he feared it, but because he'd long since found that it was almost never necessary. People, in Voss's experience, tended to fold before it came to that. He watched Clara come across the square without any particular expression. He was holding a folded document in one hand, tapping it lightly against his palm, the way a man taps a pencil when he's bored. They put her on the platform. Kern had her by the elbow. Not rough, but not asking permission either. Clara climbed the 2 steps and stood there, and felt the eyes of the whole square on her. "Folks," Voss said. He had a carrying voice without being loud, the kind that reached the back of a crowd without effort. "We're here today on a matter of settled debt. Edmund Whitmore, God rest him, left behind obligations that were called improper and legal through the Black Ridge Land Compact, Article 9, Debt Reclamation Provision. His daughter, Clara Ellen Whitmore, age 24, being the sole heir of the Whitmore estate, and the estate being insufficient to cover the balance owed—" He paused, glanced at the paper in his hand. "A balance of $412. Someone in the crowd shifted. Clara heard a breath or two, a quiet murmur that died quickly. "Is hereby being offered under Article 14, Labor Indenturement Provision, for a period of service not to exceed 18 months, the proceeds of which will be applied to the outstanding debt, with any surplus returned to the indentured party upon completion." Indenturement. That was the word Voss used. It was a careful word, a legal word, a word that implied there were rules and limitations and a proper end to things. Everyone in that square knew what it meant in practice. You belonged to whoever bought your time. You went where they said, did what they told you, and if they were the kind of man who tested the limits of the arrangement, well, the compact's enforcement officers worked for the same men who wrote the compact. Clara stood very still on that platform and looked out at the square. She thought about begging. It crossed her mind for a clear, honest moment, not as a real option, but as something to be looked at directly and decided about. She could ask Voss for mercy. She could cry. She could make herself small and frightened, which would not be entirely false, and she could appeal to whatever shred of human decency might be buried somewhere under that patient, well-dressed exterior. She didn't do it, not because she was above it. She had no illusions about her own pride mattering more than her survival. She didn't do it because she looked at Voss and she understood, with a kind of bone-cold clarity, that it wouldn't work. That man had made up his mind before he'd gotten out of bed this morning. Begging would only give him the satisfaction of watching. So she stood straight, kept her hands at her sides, looked out at the crowd, not at Voss, and waited. "We'll open bidding at $50, Voss said. "For 18 months of labor service, terms negotiable within compact guidelines. Who'll start us?" A long pause. Long enough that Clara felt a flicker of something. Not hope, exactly, but the ghost of it. Then a man near the back raised his hand. Rufus Crane, who ran a cattle operation on the north end of the valley and had 3 ranch hands and a wife who was known to be difficult. 50, he said. 50 for Mr. Crane. Do I hear 60? Another pause. Then another hand, someone she didn't recognize. A heavy-set man in a decent coat who had the look of a buyer rather than a rancher. 60. It went like that for a while. 70, 80, up to 110. The crowd watched. Clara watched. She was aware of her own heartbeat, steady and slow, the way her body sometimes went very calm in the middle of things that should have been terrifying. She'd been like that since she was a girl. Her father had called it stubbornness. Her mother had called it a gift. At 120, Crane dropped out. At 140, the man in the coat pushed it to 160 and paused, looking satisfied, like a man who's gotten what he came for. Voss looked out at the square. 160. Do I hear 170? Silence. Going once at 160. Clara was looking at the edge of the square when he appeared. She didn't hear him coming, not over the murmur of the crowd, not over the blood in her ears. What she noticed first was a shift in the people nearest the north end of the square. A few heads turned, then a few more. The change moved through the crowd like a ripple in still water, people stepping back and angling away, not running but creating space with the careful, unhurried movement of animals that have learned to read warnings. Then she saw the horse. A dark roan, deep-chested, with the kind of ground-eating walk that suggested it had covered serious distance in the not-too-distant past. The rider sat loose and easy in the saddle. A tall man in a trail-worn coat, no hat on, dark hair a little long, a few days past a shave. He was not moving fast. He came into the square at a walk and kept walking, and the crowd parted for him without anyone needing to say anything about it. Clara had heard the name Ronan Creed. Everyone in the valley had heard it. She'd never seen the man himself. He wasn't exactly what the name conjured. The stories made him sound like something from a dime novel, a figure of violent legend, all cold menace and gunfighter posture. The man riding into the square looked more like someone who'd been a long way away and had come back tired. Not harmless. Nothing about him suggested harmless, but the danger in him was quiet, not performed, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. He stopped his horse at the edge of the platform, looked up at Voss. "What's the balance owed?" he said. His voice was level. Not loud, not theatrical. Just a question. Voss looked at him for a moment with that patient, settled expression, and Clara could see the exact instant when the calculation happened behind the man's eyes, the weighing and measuring, the decision about what kind of thing this was going to be. "This is a formal proceeding under compact law, Creed," Voss said. "If you've got a comment to make, there's a proper The balance owed," Ronan said again. Same tone. "On the Whitmore debt, what's the number?" A long quiet fell over the square. Even the children who'd been kept away somehow seemed to sense that things had gone still in a particular way, the particular stillness that comes before something changes. Voss looked down at his paper. Something moved in his expression. Not quite irritation, not quite concern. More like a man adjusting to unexpected weather. $412. Ronan reached into his coat, pulled out a leather wallet. He counted bills with the methodical unhurriedness of a man who is making a point without making a speech about it, and dropped them on the platform near Voss's feet. $450, he said. 38 over. Keep the difference for your trouble. The square was absolutely silent. Voss did not move for a moment. He looked at the money, then at Ronan, then at Clara, then back at Ronan. Whatever he'd prepared for this morning, it had not included this. "This isn't how compact proceedings—" "Article 9, Ronan said. Debt reclamation provision. It says the creditor is entitled to the balance owed by any legal means of payment. I'm not aware of a clause that says cash payment from a third party doesn't count. If you've got a lawyer who can show me one, I'll wait. He wasn't being aggressive about it. That was the strangest part. He was just sitting there on his horse saying words like a man stating facts about the weather. Voss turned toward his men. Kern had his hand at his hip, watching Ronan with the focused attention of a man running options. Briggs was looking at Voss, waiting for direction. In the crowd, Clara could see movement, people recalibrating, reading the moment. "This is irregular," Voss said quietly. He had dropped the carrying voice now. This was a different conversation. "It's a cash payment on a documented debt," Ronan said. "The only thing irregular about it is that you didn't see it coming." Something moved across Voss's face then. Something that Clara would think about later in the long trying to understand of what had happened that morning. It wasn't exactly anger. It was closer to the expression of a man who has just discovered that the ground he's been standing on is not quite as solid as he thought, and is calculating very fast about what to do with that information. He picked up the money. "The debt is settled," he said, flat and formal. "Miss Whitmore is released from compact obligation." He said it the way a man drops something he's no longer interested in carrying. Not gracious, not defeated, just done. Kern's hand came away from his hip. Clara stood on the platform for a moment before she moved. She was looking at Ronan Creed, who was looking at her now for the first time since he'd ridden in. He had dark eyes, quiet eyes, with the lines around them, of a man who has spent a lot of years looking at distances. There was nothing in that look that she could readily interpret. No satisfaction, no expectation, no particular emotion that she could name. He looked at her the way you look at a problem you've decided to take on, which is to say, carefully and without enthusiasm. "You got somewhere to go?" he asked. It was such a plain, practical question that Clara almost laughed, under the circumstances. "Not at the moment," she said. He nodded at that, like it was the answer he'd expected. "Then I'd suggest you get off that platform." She climbed down. The crowd had opened up to let her pass, the same way it had opened for him, not from welcome, but from that recalibrated uncertainty, the sense that the rules of the morning had shifted and nobody was sure yet what the new rules were. Clara walked through them without looking at faces. She could feel Voss watching her from the platform. She could feel Kern watching her. She kept her shoulders back and her chin up, and she put one foot in front of the other until she reached the edge of the square. Ronan had turned his horse and was walking it toward her. He stopped alongside her and looked down. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes." "There's a livery on the south end. I've got a spare horse stabled there." He paused. "This is going to go sideways before noon, so I'd prefer not to stand around about it." Clara looked up at him. She had 100 questions and no particular idea where to start. And she was not a woman given to grateful speechifying, even when she had more time for it. "Why?" she said. Just that. Ronan looked away for a moment, out toward the edge of the valley. Something moved in his face, not easy to read, not exactly comfortable. "Your father did me a good turn once," he said, "long time ago. I'm slow about returning them." It was not a complete answer. Clara recognized it as not a complete answer, but she also recognized that it was true, as far as it went, and that the time for more complete answers was not here in this square with Voss watching from the platform and Kern's hand restless at his hip. "South End livery," she said. 10 minutes, he said, and turned his horse. You see, she was at the livery in 8. The horse he'd left for her was a compact gray mare with a white blaze and the attentive, slightly skeptical expression of an animal that has been around long enough to form opinions. There was a bedroll tied to the saddle and saddlebags that, when Clara checked them, turned out to contain dried beef, hardtack, a canteen, a folded oilskin, and a change of clothes that were too large for her but would do. He'd planned this. Not impulsively, not this morning. He'd planned this before he rode in, had thought through what she'd need and where she'd be. The realization sat strangely in her chest. Not warm, exactly. More like the feeling of discovering that someone has been paying attention in ways you didn't know about. She was tightening the mare's girth when Ronan came in, on foot now, leading his roan by the bridle. "You packed these," she said. "Last night. You knew they'd go through with it. Voss doesn't do anything he's not going to follow through on." He went to the roan saddlebag and checked something, more by habit than apparent necessity. He had a buyer set up for your place already. Man out of Caldwell, goes by the name Whitfield. He buys whatever Voss tells him to buy, and asks the kind of questions you don't ask when you're making money. Clara absorbed this. What do you know about Voss? Enough. He glanced over at her. More than I'm going to stand here and explain. You have family anywhere? Anyone you could send to? My mother's people are in Missouri. I haven't seen them since I was 12. Does Voss know about them? I don't know what Voss knows. She paused. He's been buying debts across the valley. It's not just my father. Ronan looked at her steadily. No, it's not. How long has this been going on? 2 years at least, maybe 3. He was quiet for a moment. Your father, do you know if he kept records? Bills of sale, correspondence, anything in writing? Clara went still. There was something in her face then, some change that Ronan apparently noticed, because he stopped and waited in the way of a man who has learned that waiting sometimes gets you more than asking. My father, she said carefully, was not a careful man, but he was an honest one, and he was suspicious. About Voss, about the compact, about the way the debt calls were happening. I know because he talked about it. He talked about it too much, maybe. I used to think it was just... She stopped. I used to think it was just the talk a man does when he's worried and can't do anything about it. She reached into the front of her dress. She'd sewn the pocket herself, 3 nights before Edmund died, when he'd pressed the folded papers into her hands and said, Put these somewhere they won't think to look, Clara girl, just in case. Just do this for me. She'd thought it was the illness making him strange. She'd done it anyway. She held out the papers. Ronan took them and opened them, and Clara watched his face as he read. Whatever she'd expected, some dramatic shift of expression, revelation, what she got was stillness, a deepening of that careful, measuring quiet that seemed to be how he processed most things. Where did he get these? He said. I don't know. He didn't tell me. She paused. What are they? Ledger pages. He was still reading. Voss's ledger pages, by the look of the headings. Property transactions, debt purchases, some kind of payment schedule. He looked up at her. This is a list of every farm in the valley that Voss has a claim on. Clara stared at him. Mine too? She said, though she already knew the answer. Yours too. And the Drummond place, and the Belmonts, and Hatcher's operation on the west side, and... He stopped, refolded the papers. There are 11 names on this list, 11 families. The number settled over Clara like cold water. 11. She'd known it was more than just her father, had felt the shape of something larger in the way Voss moved through Black Ridge, that settled proprietorial ease of a man who is not visiting but occupying. But 11 families, 11. He's taking the whole valley, she said. He's been taking it for 2 years. Ronan held the papers out to her, and she took them back, tucked them away. Question is what you want to do about it. What I want... She stopped, looked at him. What do you mean, what I want? You came here, you paid my debt, you packed saddlebags and planned an exit route. You've been making decisions about this all along. What do you want? He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense she'd said something that landed closer to something real than he'd expected. There was a slight shift in his expression, not quite discomfort, more like a man who is being asked to account for himself and isn't sure he has a clean accounting to offer. I want to leave, he said. That's the honest answer. I want to ride out of this valley and not look back and go somewhere that's not my problem. But those papers change the math. He looked at her steadily. Voss doesn't know what your father had, which means he doesn't know what you have, which means right now you've got something he wants and doesn't know he needs to come for yet. That's a window. A small one. The only kind there usually is. Clara was quiet. Outside the livery, she could hear the sounds of the town. Voices, a wagon going by, the distant bang of a door. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a Tuesday that was going the same as every other Tuesday, except that it wasn't, except that something had cracked open this morning that was not going to be closed up again just because people in the square had looked at their boots. My father is dead, she said. Voss killed him as surely as if he'd done it with his hands. He spent 2 years squeezing him, buying his debts away from him piece by piece, and my father spent 2 years trying to hold on because he couldn't believe that someone could do that to people and get away with it. She paused. He was wrong about that. People do get away with it all the time. Yeah, Ronan said, but not always. No, he said. Not always. Clara looked at the papers in her hand. Then she looked at Ronan Creed, this tired, dusty, careful man who had ridden into her destruction this morning and derailed it with $450 and the unhurried statement of a compact clause, and who had just told her the honest truth, which was that he wanted to leave. You're not going to leave, she said. It wasn't a question. Something moved across his face. Probably not, he said. No. She put the papers back, turned to the gray mare, and checked the girth one more time. It didn't need checking. It was fine. She just needed something to do with her hands. Then I suggest we ride, she said. You said sideways before noon. I said sideways before noon. It's 10:20. She mounted up. Outside the livery, the sun had broken free of the clouds and was hitting the main street of Black Ridge with that hard-edged morning light that made everything look more real and more temporary at the same time. Clara sat the gray mare and looked at the town she'd lived near her whole life. The storefronts, the water trough, the land office where Voss's people were no doubt already conferring about what had just happened, and she felt something settle in her chest like a stone finding the bottom of a river. She was not running. She wanted to be clear about that, in her own mind. This was not running. This was choosing what ground to fight from. Ronan rode up beside her, and they went down the main street at a walk, side by side, and nobody called out and nobody tried to stop them, and the town of Black Ridge watched them go in that same careful, neutral silence it had watched everything else. But one person didn't look away. At the edge of the square, near the dry goods store, where she'd spent the night, Clara saw Pace Drummond standing alone. He was an old man, weathered and slow, and he was not looking at his boots anymore. He was watching her ride past, and when their eyes met, something happened in his face. Not apology. That was too simple. More like the look of a man who has been standing in a cold place for too long and has just noticed that someone opened a door somewhere. Clara held his gaze for a moment. Then she rode on. The valley opened up ahead of them, wide and gold in the summer morning light, the grass running long in the creek bottoms, the ridgeline in the distance serrated against the sky. It was beautiful land. It had always been beautiful land. That was the whole trouble. Where are we going? She asked. Ronan looked out at the valley. There's an old line camp at the North Pass, up in the timber. Nobody uses it anymore. We can make it before dark. And then? And then, he said, we figure out what your father actually found. Clara reached up and straightened her hat against the wind that was starting to come down off the ridge. There was a storm somewhere behind those mountains. She could feel it in the air, that electric pressure that the valley collected between its walls when weather was building. My father, she said, was not a careful man, but he was not a stupid one either. If he got those papers from Voss's books, he didn't do it by accident. No, Ronan said. He probably didn't. Which means someone helped him. Ronan looked at her sideways. Which means someone in Voss's operation has been waiting for someone to come along and use what your father left. They rode in silence for a moment with that sitting between them. You think they'll come after us today? Clara asked. Not today. Voss isn't going to move in the open. That's not how he operates. He'll want to know what we have first. He'll send someone to find out. He paused. We've got maybe a day. Maybe 2. And the other families on that list? Ronan didn't answer right away. The horses moved through the tall grass at the valley's edge, the morning sounds of insects and wind filling the silence. That's the question, he said finally. Isn't it? Clara looked at the Drummond place as they passed it. The small square-built house, the weathered barn, the kitchen garden running a little ragged at the edges, the way a place does when the people running it are tired and scared. An old man's place. A place that was going to be on some buyer's list in Caldwell or wherever they came from, sold and absorbed and disappeared into Silas Voss's quiet, well-dressed empire. Yes, she said, that is the question. They rode north into the timber, into whatever was coming next. Behind them, Black Ridge settled back into its careful silence. But something in that silence was different now, and at least a few people standing on that main street in the hard morning light could feel it. A change in the quality of the air, the way the air sometimes changes just before a storm stops being a possibility and becomes a fact. The line camp was a single-room structure built into the lee side of a granite outcrop about 2 hours north of the valley floor, up in the timber where the pines grew close and the light came down in narrow columns through the canopy. Whoever had built it to last. Thick log walls chinked with dried mud and moss, a stone hearth with a chimney that still drew cleanly, a roof that had been repaired at least twice with materials that didn't quite match the original. It smelled of cold ash and pine resin, and the particular mustiness of a place that has been lived in and then left alone for a long time. Ronan had been here before. Clara could tell from the way he moved through the space without hesitation, knew where the door stuck, knew to lift and push at the same time, knew there was a cache of dry wood stacked under an oilskin behind the east wall without having to look for it. He didn't explain any of this, and she didn't ask. She unsaddled the gray mare and rubbed her down while Ronan started a small fire, and they ate what was in the saddlebags without much conversation, sitting on opposite sides of the hearth, while the afternoon light moved through the window, and the timber outside went from gold to gray as the clouds the morning had promised finally arrived. Clara spread the papers on the plank floor between them when it got dark enough for the firelight to matter. There were 7 pages. Edmund Whitmore had gotten them. How, she still didn't know, and had folded them small and told his daughter to hide them, and then had gone to sleep and not woken up, and the papers had sat against Clara's ribs for 3 weeks while she buried her father and answered the door when the debt collectors came and sat in Harding's back room watching the sky turn bruised. Ronan spread them flat with his palms and read them the way he seemed to do most things, quietly, methodically, without performing whatever he was thinking. Clara watched his face and read the papers herself, moving her finger along the lines Edmund's hand had hidden. What they had was a partial record. Someone inside Voss's operation had copied out pages from what appeared to be 2 separate ledgers, one tracking property acquisitions, one tracking something else, a column of payments that didn't match any property transaction Clara could identify. The names were coded, initials only in most cases, but the amounts were real and the dates were specific, and several of the property descriptions were identifiable to anyone who knew the valley. "These payments," Clara said. She tapped the second ledger. "Who are they going to?" Ronan had been quiet for a while. "The compact officers," he said. She looked up at him. He was looking at the papers, not at her. "Farwell," she said, and even as she said it, she thought of the deputy's boots, the way he couldn't meet her eyes that morning. "Probably not Farwell. He's too small." Ronan traced one column with a finger. "These amounts? 100 here, 200 there. This is not what you pay a deputy. This is what you pay a judge. A land commissioner. Someone with the authority to make the compact's legal machinery work the way you need it to work." Clara sat back on her heels. "So the compact itself is in Voss's pocket." "Has been for a while, looks like." He gathered the papers together. "Your father understood this. That's why he didn't go to the compact officers when he found it. He knew they were bought. He could have gone to a federal marshal. Nearest federal marshal is 3 days' ride, and Voss would have known before your father was an hour out of the valley." He folded the papers carefully and held them out to her. "Somebody in this valley is watching the roads." Clara took the papers. She held them for a moment, looking at them. 7 pages. Her father's last act of stubbornness, pressed into her hands in the dark of his sickness. "You said someone inside Voss's operation helped him get these," she said. "I said that's what it looked like. So there's someone we could find. Or someone who could find us." Ronan leaned back against the log wall. He looked tired in the firelight, in the particular way of a man carrying something he'd been carrying for too long. If they wanted to make contact, they'd have done it by now. More likely, whoever it was gave your father what they could and then went quiet, self-preservation. "Can't blame them for that," Clara said. It came out more flat than she intended. Ronan looked at her. "No," he said. "You can't." She set the papers down. Outside, the rain had started. Not a dramatic storm, just a steady mountain rain, the kind that settles in and plans to stay. It hissed through the pine needles and ticked against the roof and made the fire seem warmer by contrast, which Clara recognized as the kind of false comfort that got people killed if they weren't careful. "Tell me about my father," she said. "You said he did you a good turn." "When?" A long pause. The fire popped and settled. 12 years ago, Ronan said. "I was 22 and doing the kind of work that 22-year-olds do when they're better at being capable than being wise. I ended up in a bad situation on the Eastern Road. Horse was lame, I was in no condition to walk, and the men I'd been working for had decided my usefulness was at an end." He said it plainly, without drama, the way you describe weather. "Your father came past with his wagon. He didn't know me from any other man on that road. He put me in the wagon and drove me to his place and let me sleep in his barn for 2 weeks while I got sorted. He didn't ask questions? He asked plenty of questions. He just didn't need me to answer them all." Something shifted in Ronan's expression. He was like that. He could read what a man needed and decide whether he was going to provide it before the man finished explaining himself. Clara recognized this. It was so exactly her father that her throat tightened without warning, and she turned her face toward the fire for a moment until it passed. "I left before he woke up the morning I was well enough to go," Ronan continued, "which was cowardly of me, I know that. I told myself I'd come back when I had something to offer instead of just taking." He was quiet. "I took a while." 12 years, Clara said. "I heard about his debts, about what Voss was doing. I heard about it last spring from a man coming through Delwood. Took me some time to get affairs in order." He looked at her directly. "I wasn't in time to help him. I know that." Clara looked at him. He was waiting for something. Not absolution, she didn't think, but maybe acknowledgement. The kind a person needs when they've said an honest thing out loud. "He would have said you came when you came," she said. "He didn't hold ledgers on people." "No," Ronan said. "He didn't." They sat with that for a while, the rain steady and the fire low, two people who had been strangers this morning and were now something else. Not friends, not anything with a clean name, but something real that had been built out of a bad morning and a long road and 7 pages of damning numbers. It was Clara who moved first. She picked up the papers and started reading them again, more slowly this time, not looking for the big pattern, but looking at the details, the specific dates, the specific amounts, the property descriptions. "The Hatcher place," she said. "Western side of the valley. There's a notation here. It's dated 6 months ago. But Hatcher's farm is still running. I've seen him in town." Ronan came and crouched beside her, looking over her shoulder. "The debt was purchased 6 months ago. Doesn't mean it was called in yet." "Then Voss is sitting on these, collecting them like—" She stopped. "Like a hand of cards," Ronan said. "He wants to play them all at once." Clara looked up. "He's going to call them all at once, not one at a time, all of them, same time, same proceeding, 11 families." Ronan stood slowly. He moved to the window and looked out at the rain falling through the timber, and Clara watched his shoulders and read the set of them the way you learn to read the physical language of a person you're stuck in a small space with. "When?" she said. "I don't know the specific timing, but Voss had a buyer in place for your land before you were even on the platform this morning. That's not improvised. He's been staging these for a while." He turned from the window. "I'd guess before the summer's out. He'll want to have it settled before the fall compact session. New officers could complicate things." "That's 8 weeks," Clara said. "Maybe 10. Maybe." She stood up. She was sore from the ride and tired in the deep way of a person who hasn't slept properly in 3 weeks, and she was standing in a line camp in the mountains with a man she'd known for approximately 8 hours and a handful of papers that might be enough to stop a man who owned half the valley's legal machinery, and the whole situation was impossible enough that the only rational response was to keep moving. "We need to talk to the other families," she said. Ronan looked at her with that careful, quiet expression. "They're scared," he said. "Same scared that kept them quiet this morning." "I know. I watched them look at their boots while I stood on that platform." She didn't say it with heat, just accurate and flat. But scared people do things when they understand they have no other choice. Right now, they think they might still have a choice. Voss has been careful to let them think that. When they understand what he's actually planning, Some of them will still fold, you know that. Some of them, not all of them. She looked at him. Pace Drummond was watching me when I rode out. Did you see that? I saw it. He's on the list. His place is on the list. She paused. He knew my father. He knew him well. Ronan didn't say anything to that, but he wasn't arguing either, and Clara had been reading people long enough to know the difference. We can't go to the compact officers, she said. We can't go to a federal marshal without Voss knowing. We can't go to a lawyer in Black Ridge because Voss owns half of them, and the other half are too scared to act. She folded the papers and held them up. What we can do is show these to 11 families and let them understand that the man who's been smiling at them across the compact table for 2 years has had their names on a list this whole time. Ronan was quiet for a moment. Voss will come after us when he realizes you're talking to people. Yes. He's got 6, 7 men on his payroll that I know about. Kern alone is... I know what Kern is, Clara said. I've seen the way he moves. Then you know this isn't going to stay quiet. I know. She looked at him directly. I'm not asking you to promise me it ends well. I'm not even asking you to promise me it ends. I'm asking whether you're in or out. It was the plainest she'd put it. No drama in it, no appeal. Just the question sitting between them, the way a proposition sits, waiting to be picked up or left. Ronan looked at her for a long moment. Whatever he was turning over behind those quiet dark eyes, he turned it over thoroughly. There's a thing you should know about me, he said. I'm not good company. I'm not easy. I've got a history in this territory that complicates some things, and I am not going to explain all of it to you tonight or possibly ever. I'm not asking you to explain yourself, Claire said. I'm asking if you're in. I'm in, he said. I've been in since I counted out that money this morning. I'm just... He stopped. I want you to know what you're getting. A man who plans ahead and pays debts slow, Clara said. I've got worse. Something shifted in his face then. Not quite a smile, but the edge of one, the involuntary kind that comes before a person can stop it. It was there for a second, and then it was gone, and he turned back to the window. We'll start with Drummond, he said. In the morning, early, before Voss has men moving. Drummond first, she agreed. Then we work the list. She lay down on the narrow bunk that night with the papers tucked inside her dress again, and listened to the rain on the roof and thought about her father, about the bills he'd signed, the debts he'd let accumulate, the way he'd pressed these pages into her hands without fully explaining why. She wondered if he'd known, at the end, that it would come to this. If he'd understood that what he was doing was not just hiding evidence, but passing something forward, a task, a responsibility, a refusal to let the thing die with him. She thought he probably had. Edmund Whitmore had not been a careful man, but there at the end, with whatever time he had left, he had been something better than careful. He had been deliberate. She closed her eyes. Outside, the rain kept falling, steady and indifferent, moving through the timber and down the slopes toward the valley, where 11 families slept in houses that a careful, well-dressed man with a patient face had been quietly, systematically stripping away from them for 2 years. In the morning, she was going to start doing something about that. She wasn't sure it would be enough. She wasn't sure she wouldn't fail completely, end up worse off than she'd started, drag the people she was trying to help into something uglier than what they were already in. She held all of that clearly in her mind, looked at it without flinching, and let it sit there. Then she slept. Across the room, Ronan Creed sat awake a while longer, not moving, watching the fire burn down. He was thinking about Kern. He was thinking about Voss's face when he dropped that money on the platform. The flash of calculation, the quick and practiced recovery. He was thinking about the last time he'd been in this valley, and what had happened, and the person he'd been then, which was not a comfortable thing to think about, and was therefore exactly the kind of thing he made himself think about regularly, like a man pressing on a bruise to check whether it's healed. It hadn't healed. But it had changed. Things did, eventually, if you were still alive to notice. He let the fire go out and lay down on the floor with his coat over him and listened to the rain. And in a while he slept too, and Black Ridge sat quiet below them in the dark, and Silas Voss sat in his well-appointed office above the land office and read his own list of names and thought about contingencies, the way a careful man does when the morning has gone differently than planned. Pace Drummond opened his door before they knocked. He was standing in the frame with a lantern in one hand and a look on his face that said he'd been awake for a while. The particular hollowed-out expression of a man who has spent the night deciding something and isn't sure yet whether the decision is going to hold. The sky behind Clara and Ronan was the gray-pink of very early morning, the timber still dark at the edges, the valley below just beginning to take shape out of the dark. "Figured you'd come," Drummond said. His voice was rough with age and sleeplessness. He stepped back from the door without being asked. Inside, the house was clean in the spare way of an old man living alone. Everything in its place, nothing extra. The table by the window set with a coffee pot and 2 mugs that he'd clearly put out before he heard them on the path. Clara registered that. He'd set 2 mugs. He'd known, or guessed close enough. He poured without asking and sat down across from them and put his weathered hands flat on the table and said, "Show me what you have." Clara laid the papers out. Drummond read them the way old men read things that matter, slowly, without rushing, going back twice on certain lines. His face didn't change much. That told her something. It told her he wasn't entirely surprised. "Your father showed me 1 page, Drummond said finally. "Last winter, just the one. The property acquisition list. I thought he was—" He stopped. "I told him he was reading too much into it. I told him Voss was a hard businessman, but that didn't make him a criminal." He looked up at Clara. "I was wrong about that." "You couldn't have known for certain," Clara said. "I could have listened better," he said, flat and honest. "Same thing." Ronan spoke for the first time since they'd sat down. "We need to know if you'll talk to the other families. You've been here longer than most. They'll hear it from you different than they'll hear it from us." Drummond looked at him. The old man and the tired rider studied each other across the table in the early morning light with the kind of frank sizing up attention that men of a certain age and experience don't bother disguising. "I know who you are," Drummond said. "Most people do," Ronan said. "That name scares some folks." "I know that too." "It scare you?" Drummond asked Clara, which was not what she'd expected. She thought about it for a real second before she answered. "No," she said. "Not him." Drummond looked between them. Something settled in his expression, not warm exactly, but decided. "I'll talk to Hatcher and the Belmonts," he said. "Hatcher's stubborn, but he's not stupid. The Belmont girls have been scared for months. They'll move if they understand there's something to move toward." He paused. "The others are harder. Crane won't listen to anyone who isn't offering him something. Pettiford's been taking small payments from Voss to look the other way on the water rights. He's compromised." "Pettiford's on the list same as everyone else," Clara said. "I know, but he doesn't know that yet." Drummond picked up his coffee. That might be the thing that turns him. They left Drummond's place as the sun broke over the eastern ridge, and they spent the next 2 days moving through the valley in pieces, careful about roads and times, avoiding the routes that Voss's outriders were known to travel. It was exhausting work, the kind that doesn't look like much from the outside. 2 people on horseback having quiet conversations in farmhouse kitchens. But that cost something deep, because every conversation required starting from fear and trying to get somewhere past it, and fear is heavy going. Hatcher listened without expression, read the papers, and said he needed a day. He sent his boy to find them at the North Creek crossing the following morning with a single word on a folded piece of paper. "In." The Belmont sisters, Margaret and younger Dora, who ran their dead father's place with more competence than most men Clara knew, read the papers together at the kitchen table and didn't speak for a long moment. Then Margaret said, "We knew something was wrong. We just didn't know the shape of it." And Dora, who had learned to read from Clara 6 years ago and had grown into a sharp-eyed 20-year-old since then, looked at Clara directly and said, "What do you need us to do?" That was the best conversation they had. Others were harder. 2 families refused to talk to them at all. Doors that had been friendly once, now closed and locked with the particular finality of people who have made a calculation about survival and are committed to it. Clara didn't argue at those doors. She understood them. It didn't make her feel better about it. Pettiford was the worst. He was a thick-necked man in his 40s who'd inherited his father's cattle operation and run it adequately, never brilliantly, with the kind of stubbornness that can look like determination until it doesn't. He met them in his yard rather than inviting them inside, which told Clara everything about where the conversation was going to go. "I've got nothing to say to either of you," he said, looking at Ronan rather than her, "and I'll thank you not to come on my land again." "Voss has a debt claim on your property," Clara said. "Purchased 14 months ago. Same as mine, same as Drummond's." "That's not—" He stopped. Something shifted in his face. "It's on the list," she said. "His list. Your name, your property description, the amount he paid for your note, and the date he's planning to call it." She held the papers out, not forcing them on him, just making them available. He didn't take them, but he didn't look away either. "I've done business with Voss," he said. His voice had changed, still stubborn, but the certainty had cracked a little, the way ice cracks before it goes. "I know," Clara said. "He was careful to give people reasons to trust him before he took from them. That's how it works." Pettiford stood in his yard for a long moment with his hands hanging at his sides, looking at a spot somewhere between Clara and the fence line. Then he said, "I want to see the page with my name on it." Clara handed it to him. She watched him read it, watched the color come up in his neck and his jaw go tight, and whatever complicated arrangement he'd made with himself about Silas Voss come apart in the space of 30 seconds of reading. He handed the paper back without speaking and went inside and shut the door. Clara looked at Ronan. "That one might go either way," Ronan said quietly. "I know, but he knows now. Regardless of what he decides to do about it, he knows." On the third day, the smoke appeared. They saw it from the ridge trail, mid-morning, a thick column rising from the south end of the valley, the black-gray color of burning structure rather than burning grass. Ronan pulled his horse up hard, and they both sat looking at it, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there wasn't much to say. They both knew what it was. It was the Callow place. A young couple, Will and Nessa Callow, who'd come to the valley 2 years ago and built up a small operation on 20 acres of good bottomland. Clara had not been able to reach them. They'd been on a list of families she was still working toward. They were also, she now understood with a cold certainty, on a different kind of list. "He's moving faster," Ronan said, "because we've been moving faster." Clara was already turning her horse toward the south. "Come on." "Clara, I know." She looked back at him. "I know what we're riding toward. Come on." The Callow place was a ruin by the time they reached it. The house gutted, the barn half standing, the kitchen garden a mess of trampled earth and scattered tools. Will Callow was sitting in the yard with a gash on his forearm that had been wrapped in what looked like a piece of his own shirt, watching the last of his house burn with an expression beyond shock, beyond anger, somewhere in the flat country that comes after both of those. Nessa was behind him, sitting on an upturned water trough with their young daughter on her lap, the child's face buried against her mother's shoulder. Nessa was holding the girl and staring straight ahead, and her eyes had the particular dry, fixed look of someone who has finished crying, not because they're better, but because they've run out. "Who did this?" Ronan asked. He dismounted and was crouching in front of Will, keeping his voice level. "Kern," Will said. The name came out flat, stripped of everything. "And 2 others I didn't know, came before sunrise. Told us we had a week to vacate per the compact claim." He looked at his burned house. "Then Kern said they might as well save us the trouble of packing." "Did they—" Ronan started. "We got out," Will said. He was looking at Nessa, checking her in the continuous automatic way of a man who is not done being scared. "We got out." Clara crouched beside Nessa. The younger woman looked at her with those dry, fixed eyes, and Clara looked back and didn't offer comfort she didn't have, just held the look and let it be real. "You'll come with us," Clara said. "Tonight, there's a place." "To do what?" Nessa said. Her voice was quiet and steady in the way of someone who is controlling it very carefully. "Run? They'll just—" "Not to run," Clara said. Something in her tone reached through. Nessa focused on her, really focused, for the first time. "Then to do what?" she said again. "To end it," Clara said. She said it plainly, without theater, the way you state a fact about the weather. And maybe because of that, because there was nothing performed about it, no borrowed courage or false certainty, Nessa held her gaze for a long moment, and then, slowly, nodded. Ronan had learned something from Will Callow, in the meantime, that changed the shape of the next few days completely. Voss was holding a gathering. He'd called it himself, framed it as a valley council, a chance for landowners to discuss the upcoming fall compact session, hosted at his own ranch on the following Saturday. Formal invitations, politely worded, with the particular quality of invitations you don't decline. "He's done this before?" Claire asked on the ride north with the Callows behind them. "Once," Ronan said. 2 years ago. That's when the compact revisions went through, the ones that gave the land syndicate expanded debt reclamation authority. He presented them as minor procedural updates at a gathering just like this one, and everyone signed because everyone was being polite, and nobody had read the fine print. He paused. This time he's going to present the bulk transfers. All 11 properties at once. He'll frame it as a debt resolution proceeding. In front of the families themselves? In front of witnesses he's selected. Compact officers, the buyer from Caldwell, a lawyer from the territorial capital who's been on his payroll for 3 years. He looked at her. He wants it to look clean. He wants a room full of people watching it happen legally and orderly. Clara was quiet for a long stretch of trail. The Callows were a few lengths behind them, Will driving their cart with what little they'd salvaged, Nessa sitting beside him with the child and that terrible fixed expression that Clara kept seeing when she closed her eyes. "Then that's where we go," she said. Ronan turned to look at her fully. "Clara, that's where we go," she said again. "He wants witnesses? He'll get them. He wants a room full of people to watch it happen. Fine. Let them watch something else instead. If you walk into that gathering with those papers, with Drummond there and Hatcher and the Belmonts and the Callows and whoever else we can bring, Voss will have armed men in that room. I know that. Kern will be there. I know that too." Ronan rode in silence for a moment, looking ahead at the trail. His jaw was tight in the way it got when he was running through things he didn't like the options of. "You're not going to talk me out of it," Clara said. "I'm not trying to," he said. "I'm just—" He stopped. "I want you to understand that this is the point of no return. You walk into that room, Voss will know that hiding isn't an option anymore, for either of us. He'll come direct after that." "He burned the Callow place on day 3, Clara said. "There's no hiding left anyway." He couldn't argue with that. They spent Saturday morning at the line camp with 6 people crammed into the small space: Drummond, Will, and Nessa Callow, Margaret and Dora Belmont, and Hatcher, who had come in the night before and had said barely 12 words total, but had the solidity of a man who'd made his decision and intended to stand in it. The gray morning light came through the window, and Clara stood with her back to the fire and laid out what she had and what she intended to do with it. She didn't make a speech. She wasn't built for speeches, and this group wasn't looking for one. She just told them plainly, "Here are the papers, here's what they say, here's what Voss has planned, and here's what we're going to do instead." When she was done, she said, "I need to know who's coming in with me and who's staying outside, and I need the truth, not what you think I want to hear." Margaret Belmont said she was going in. Dora said the same. Drummond said yes without hesitation. Hatcher said, "Yeah," which from him was a complete sentence. Will Callow looked at Nessa, and Nessa said, "We're both going." That left the question of Ronan, which was not really a question. He was leaning against the far wall, his arms folded, watching her. When she looked at him, he just said, "I'll be outside." "Outside is its own risk," she said. "I know, but I'll be more useful outside." He met her eyes. "Trust me on that." She trusted him on that. Voss's ranch sat at the center of the valley like a man who has arranged the room around himself. The main house large and well-built, the grounds maintained with the kind of deliberate care that signals money, the long fence line running in both directions as far as you could see. There were horses at the hitching rail when they arrived. 12, maybe more, and light in the windows, and the sound of voices from inside. The particular buzz of a room full of people being socially careful. Clara rode to the gate with Drummond on her left and the Belmont sisters just behind, the Callows and Hatcher further back, and she thought about her father. about Edmund pressing those papers into her hands in the dark, and the way he'd looked at her, and the way she'd thought he was being strange from his illness. He hadn't been strange. He'd been trusting her with the only thing he had left to give. She dismounted. She straightened her hat. She tucked the papers inside her dress one more time against her ribs and felt the slight crinkle of them. 7 pages. Her father's last deliberate act, carried 3 weeks against a heartbeat. Then she walked toward Voss's door. Inside, the gathering was in full motion. 20-odd people in Voss's large front room, standing with drinks, talking in the careful, sideways way of people who aren't sure what they're agreeing to yet, but haven't said no. A long table had been set up at the far end with documents on it, and Voss's lawyer from the capital was arranging papers with the brisk efficiency of a man who intends to get through a lot of signatures before anyone reads anything. Voss was in the center of the room. He saw her the instant she came through the door. His expression did not change. Not a flicker, not a tell. Just that settled, patient face adjusting to new information the way water adjusts to a new container. The room, however, was not as controlled. Heads turned. The buzz of conversation dropped in pieces, like instruments stopping one by one. By the time Clara reached the middle of the room, it was quiet enough to hear the fire in the hearth. She reached into her dress and brought out the papers. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying to the walls. "Most of you know me. Some of you were in the square 4 days ago when Silas Voss put me on a platform and sold my future to settle my father's debts." She looked around the room. The ranchers, the compact officers, the lawyer, the man from Caldwell in his decent coat. "My father left me something before he died. I want to share it with you." She laid the papers on the table next to Voss's lawyer's documents. "These are pages from Voss's operating ledger," she said. "They list every debt he's purchased in this valley over the past 2 years. They list the payment arrangements with the compact officers who've been approving his proceedings." She looked at the men she knew, the 2 compact officers standing near the window, both of them gone rigid, both of them calculating. "And they list the 11 properties in this valley that he intends to transfer to an outside buyer today, in this room, in this proceeding." The room was absolutely still. Then Voss said, "Miss Whitmore." Calm, carrying, exactly the same voice he'd used in the square. "Those documents are stolen property from a private business operation, and any claim made based on your name is on them," Drummond said from behind her. His old voice filled the room with the authority of 30 years of living in this valley. "Your name, your hand, your numbers. I know your hand, Silas. I've signed enough contracts with you." He stepped forward, and people made space for him. "And my name is on that list. My place that I built with my father, and that I've worked for 40 years. He looked around the room at the other ranchers, the families Clara hadn't been able to reach, the people who'd been carefully kept in the dark. "What's your name on, friends? That's worth asking today." What followed was not orderly. Clara had not expected orderly. What she had expected, and what she got, was the particular chaotic energy of a room full of people suddenly revising everything they thought they understood, all at once, with nowhere to put the revision but out loud. The compact officers were talking over each other. The lawyer from the capital had picked up the papers and was reading them with an expression that suggested he was calculating the distance between his current position and something he'd been told was a simple transaction. The buyer from Caldwell, the man in the decent coat who'd bid $160 at her auction, had moved to a corner and was watching everything with the still, careful attention of a man deciding whether he's been used. And through all of it, Voss stood at the center of his own room and did not lose his composure. He was managing it, raising his voice precisely enough to be heard, redirecting, offering explanations the way a man manages a fire before it gets away from him entirely. He was good at it. He had been doing it for a long time, but the fire was already getting away from him. Clara stood at the table with the papers in front of her and watched the room come apart, and she thought, this is not enough. This is a beginning, not an end. The room going loud and confused was not accountability. The compact officers looking guilty was not justice. Voss would get control of this room back in 20 minutes if she let him, and then the papers would be seized and she'd be looking at charges for theft of private documents, and the 11 families would be back where they started, except with Voss angrier and less patient than before. She had known this when she walked in. She had planned for the next part. Outside, she heard a horse, then several horses, moving fast toward the front of the ranch. She looked at the window. Through the glass, she could see the gate, and beyond the gate, a line of riders coming up the main approach, more than a dozen of them, and the last of the afternoon sun catching the dust they raised. Not Voss's men. These were valley people, the Hendersons from the East Creek, the Murrow brothers, two families she hadn't been able to reach but who, apparently Drummond or Hatcher had managed to find. And at the far edge, Pettiford, his thick neck and broad shoulders unmistakable, riding in last like a man who has argued with himself all the way, and is still not entirely happy with the argument's conclusion. Ronan had done that. She'd trusted him outside for a reason. Voss saw them too. She watched him look out the window, and she watched the calculation shift in his face. Not panic, not yet, but the first recognition that the room is smaller than it was a moment ago, that the options that seemed available have begun to close. He looked at Clara across the room. For the first time, she thought she could see past the patience and the theater of the man, to whatever was actually underneath. Not anything like remorse, nothing as simple as that. More like the look of a man who has been playing a long and patient game and has just discovered that someone else has been playing it too. "You think this changes anything?" he said. Quiet now. Not the caring voice, the real one. "I think it changes everything," Clara said. Outside, the riders reached the gate, and Black Ridge Valley had its own back for the first time in 2 years. The riders at the gate changed the mathematics of the room in a way that no amount of talking could have managed. It wasn't that they came in armed. Most of them weren't, or at least weren't displaying it. It was the number. 14 people riding up to Voss's gate in the late afternoon light, unhurried, deliberate, the kind of arrival that says we decided to come rather than we were sent. That distinction mattered in a valley where Voss had spent 2 years making sure that nobody decided anything without his knowledge. The arrival said, "The machinery has slipped," and everyone in that room understood it. Kern understood it first. Claire had been watching him since she walked in, had kept him in her peripheral vision the way you keep a fire in your peripheral vision when you're working near it. He was standing to the right of the main door, arms loose at his sides, with that particular quality of attention that dangerous men have, the kind that looks relaxed until it isn't. When the riders appeared at the gate, his eyes went to Voss immediately, running a question. Voss gave him nothing, just the patient face, adjusting. That hesitation was information. Clara filed it. The room had gone loud and stayed loud, voices overlapping, ranchers demanding explanations, the compact officers trying to establish some procedural order that nobody was interested in, the lawyer from the Capitol speaking quietly and urgently to the buyer from Caldwell, who kept looking at the papers on the table with the expression of a man counting what this is going to cost him. Margaret Belmont had taken up a position near the table and was not moving away from it, which meant the documents were not moving either, which was exactly what Clara had asked her to do. Drummond had found the men he knew and was talking to them in the low, direct way of someone delivering facts rather than arguments. Clara could see it working in real time, the shifting of postures, the recalibrating of expressions, the slow, uncomfortable process of people accepting that the thing they'd been told was solid is not solid. Voss moved toward her through the crowd, not rushing. He had the look of a man who has decided that the best play left is a direct conversation, which told Clara that his other plays had run out. "You've made your point," he said, close enough now that it was between them. "These people are frightened and confused, and you've given them something to be frightened about. That's a skill." He said it without sarcasm, just accurate. But frightened and confused is not the same as legally actionable. Those papers are taken from private business records. My lawyer will have an injunction filed before the week is out, and every person in this room who's touched them will be named in— "The buyer from Caldwell," Clara said. Voss stopped. "His name is Whitfield," she said. "That's what you told me, or close enough. He buys what you tell him to buy and doesn't ask questions. Except that right now he is asking questions, and what he's asking is whether he's been made a party to something that's going to follow him back to Caldwell and sit on his doorstep." She looked past Voss to where Whitfield was still in conversation with the lawyer, his face troubled. "Because he's not loyal to you. He's a businessman. Loyalty goes where the money is safe, and right now the money doesn't look safe. Voss turned slightly to look at Whitfield. A small movement, but it was the first time since she'd walked in that his attention had gone somewhere other than the room's management. "And your lawyer," Clara continued, "from the territorial capital. He traveled a long way for a routine proceeding. He's going to want to understand why it isn't routine." She paused. "Those compact officers over there have been taking your payments for 3 years. That's on the papers. When the territorial capital starts looking, and once that lawyer asks questions, they will start looking, those officers are going to need someone to give up. You're the someone." Voss turned back to her. He looked at her for a long moment with that patient face, and Clara stood and looked back, and she was aware of how tired she was. Bone tired, 3 nights of bad sleep, 2 days of hard riding, the kind of tired that gets into the joints and sits there. She was aware that she was a 24-year-old woman in her dead mother's dress, standing in the middle of a man's house that she had no legal right to be in, making arguments to a man who had 50 times her resources and had been doing this since before she was grown. She was aware of all of it, and she stayed standing. "You're very sure of yourself," Voss said. "No," she said. "I'm very sure of those papers." Outside, she heard the riders reaching the front of the house. Voices, the creak of saddle leather, horses blowing after a push. Ronan's voice among them, brief and directing. The sound of people taking up positions, not violently, just placing themselves. Kern heard it too. He moved toward the front door. "Don't," Ronan said from the doorway. He'd come in behind the riders, quiet enough that Kern hadn't registered him. Clara had known he would do exactly this, and the relief of seeing him standing in that doorway was something she didn't let show on her face but felt clearly in her chest. Kern stopped. He was calculating. Clara could see it, the rapid assessment of numbers and positions and outcomes. There were 14 people outside and an undetermined number who might act inside. And Ronan Creed was standing 8 feet away from him. Kern was dangerous. Ronan was something else. The room understood this in the visceral way that rooms understand things, without anyone saying it. A space opened around Kern without conscious intention, people shifting away, and he was left standing in a cleared circle of floor, with his options laid out plainly in front of him. "You've got 2 men outside the back," Ronan said. It was addressed to Kern, but loud enough for the room. "I know where they are. They're not positioned for anything useful at this point." He looked at Kern steadily. "And you're smart enough to count." Kern's jaw moved. His eyes went to Voss. This time Voss was the one who looked away first. The smallest thing. Just a fractional turn of the head, a look toward the window. But Kern saw it, and Clara saw Kern see it. And something went out of the man's posture, not fear exactly, more like the release of a weight that a person had been carrying on behalf of someone else. His hand came away from his hip. "Smart," Ronan said. Not triumphant, just accurate. What happened in the following hour was not clean, and it was not fast. Clara hadn't expected it to be. The room had to be talked through itself. Arguments circling back, the compact officers trying to negotiate their own exposure, Voss's lawyer going through a very visible internal process of deciding where his professional obligations actually lay when the client's business turned out to be built on documents he hadn't known existed. Whitfield asked to read the papers himself, and Clara let him, and watched him read them with the focused attention of a man doing arithmetic on his own losses. "I was told these were standard debt reclamation proceedings," Whitfield said. He was speaking to no one in particular, or maybe to himself. "Compact sanctioned, clean title." "You were told that by Voss," Clara said. "Yes." "And you didn't verify it independently because the compact officers had signed off and it looked clean." He looked at her. "That's correct?" "The compact officers were paid to sign off," she said. "The papers show the amounts and the dates." She paused. "You're not the wrongdoer here, Mr. Whitfield, but you're not getting 11 Valley properties either." He folded the page he'd been reading and set it down with the particular care of a man setting down something he does not want to be holding. "I'll need to speak with my own counsel," he said. "That seems wise." The compact officers were the hardest part. There were 2 of them, a man named Geary, who was the senior officer and had been in the position for 7 years, and a younger one called Marsh, who had only been appointed 14 months ago and who looked, Clara thought, like someone who had understood too late what he'd been walking into. Marsh was pale and kept looking at the door. Geary was doing what men do when they're cornered and experienced, arguing procedure. These documents cannot be authenticated without a full review, Geary said. He'd rallied himself into a kind of professional rigidity, formal language as armor. Any action taken on the basis of unverified— Geary, Drummond said. Just the name, flat and final. I've known you 15 years? Don't. Geary stopped. My name is on those papers, Drummond said. My property. And yours is on there too, in the payment column. 3 entries, clear as anything. He looked at the older man with something that wasn't anger and wasn't pity, but was somewhere between them. The look of someone confronting a disappointment they've had time to prepare for. Don't stand here and tell us about authentication. Geary sat down heavily in the nearest chair. He put his face in his hands. It was not a dignified moment, and he knew it, and there was nothing to do about it. Voss had been quiet for 15 minutes, standing near the window, watching the proceedings in his own house with that patient expression. But the patience was different now, Clara thought. It had changed quality. Earlier it had been the patience of a man managing, redirecting, playing for position. Now it was something more like the patience of a man waiting for a moment that he believes is still coming. She watched him. He was watching the back of the room, watching Kern, who had drifted, not dramatically, just a step here, a step there, the gradual repositioning of a man who is thinking about a specific door. The back hallway. Past the kitchen, out to the yard, the horses at the side of the house. Clara moved before she'd consciously finished the thought. She went across the room quickly, not running, just moving with purpose, and she put herself between Voss and the hallway. Not confrontational. She didn't touch him, didn't threaten, just stood there, between him and the way out. Voss looked at her. Miss Whitmore? The papers stay in this room, she said. You stay in this room. You can't hold me here. I'm not holding you anywhere. She kept her voice even. You can walk out that door right now. Nobody's going to physically stop you. But those papers go with me either way, and the people in this room have already seen them, and Ronan Creed is outside with 14 Valley residents and a very clear sense of which roads lead where. She held his gaze. The only thing walking out that door does is add flight to the account. Something moved in Voss's face. The first thing that had moved in it that she could honestly call human. Not the political adjustments, not the management, but something actual. She thought it might have been the first real look he'd given her since the morning of the auction. The first time he was looking at Clara Whitmore, the person, rather than Clara Whitmore, the complication. Your father, he said. He was a stubborn man. Yes, she said, ran the same stretch of rock and grass for 20 years on nothing but stubbornness. And good water, she said. Don't forget the creek. His mouth moved, not quite a smile. Not anything with warmth in it, more like the involuntary acknowledgement of something he didn't want to acknowledge. You're not going to let this rest, he said. No, she said. I'm not. He stood there for another moment, and she watched him do it. Watched the last of the plays run out, one by one, the way you watch cards turned over on a table until there are no cards left. Then he turned from the window and walked to the chair beside Geary and sat down. It wasn't surrender. Clara was clear-eyed enough to know that. It was a man making a tactical calculation. That sitting was better than running when running had no good destination. That the room full of witnesses was a liability in both directions. That the papers were already copied in 3 people's memories if not on paper. And that whatever came next was going to require a lawyer better than the one currently trying to become invisible in the corner. But he sat. Kern, without Voss standing, had nothing left to organize himself around. He leaned against the wall and looked at the floor and stayed there. Ronan came fully into the room then. He moved to Clara's side without announcement, and she felt him there, not touching, not positioning dramatically, just present the way a wall is present, solid and without performance. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. We need someone to ride for the territorial marshal, she said to the room. 3 days there, 3 days back, 7 papers, 7 signatures from people in this room willing to put their names to what they've seen. She looked around at the ranchers, the Belmonts, the Callows, Hatcher, Drummond. I need those signatures now, before anyone has time to think better of it. Margaret Belmont already had a pen in her hand. Clara didn't ask where she'd gotten it. They signed at the table that Voss had set up for his own documents, which Clara found satisfying in a way she didn't examine too closely. 7 signatures. More than she'd expected, fewer than she'd hoped, but enough. Will Callow signed last, his hand slightly unsteady from the wound on his arm. And when he was done, he looked at the paper like a man who has just done the most significant thing he's done in years and is not sure how he feels about it. Hatcher volunteered to ride. He was already moving for the door when he said it, which was consistent with how he'd operated through this entire thing. Decisions made, then announced on the way out. "Take the North Road," Ronan said. "Don't use the Valley Road." "I know which road to take," Hatcher said, and left. The room settled into a long, uncomfortable state that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite crisis. The particular limbo of a situation that has been broken open but not yet resolved, where the outcome is no longer in the hands of the people who started it and hasn't yet landed in the hands of the people who will finish it. Voss sat in his chair. The compact officers sat with him. The room around them held its position, not celebratory, just present, witnessing. Doing the thing the Valley had failed to do on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago when a woman stood on a platform and nobody said anything. Clara went outside. The evening had come fully down while they were inside, and the valley was in that particular deep blue dusk that happens when the mountains hold the light longer than the floor. The riders who'd come with Ronan were still there. Some had dismounted, some were still in the saddle, all of them with the slightly dazed quality of people who'd come expecting one kind of thing and gotten another. Pettiford was among them, off his horse, standing with his hands in his pockets, and his expression doing something complicated. When he saw Clara come out, he walked over. She waited. "I want you to know," he said, and stopped. Tried again. "I took money from him. Not a lot, but I took it." He was looking somewhere past her left ear. "I told myself it was just easiest to look the other way, that it wasn't my business what he did with the properties, that—" He stopped again. "Pettiford," Claire said. "Yeah. Your name's on his list, same as everyone else's. You know that." "I know. Whatever you took, whatever you looked away from, that's between you and the people you looked away from." She paused. "You rode in tonight. That matters." He looked at her then, directly, and she could see what it cost him. Not the riding in, but the being looked at, the being counted and accounted for by someone whose accounting he'd earned poorly. He nodded once and moved away. Ronan came out and stood beside her. They both looked at the valley in the near dark, the shapes of the ridgeline against the sky, the thin line of the creek catching the last of the light somewhere below. "Hatcher made it out the North Road clean," Ronan said. "I had Dora watch the south approach. Nobody moved to cut him off." "Voss let him go," Clara said. "Voss is playing a longer game now. He'll have a lawyer from the capital arguing document provenance before the marshal gets here." He paused. "It's going to be ugly when the territorial process starts. Months, maybe." "I know. And some of what's in those papers is going to be hard to prove without Voss's cooperation. The payment column. Those officers will claim it was something else. Consulting fees, whatever their lawyer tells them to say." "I know that too," Clara said. "I just want you to be prepared for it not going—" "Ronan." She looked at him. "I know it's not over. I know it's going to be a long fight, and some of it's going to go wrong, and Voss will get his lawyers in front of it, and it won't be simple." She held his gaze. "But the families in that valley know tonight what they didn't know this morning, and there are 7 signatures on a paper riding north right now. And Silas Voss is sitting in his own house instead of moving freely through the valley he thought he owned." She paused. "That's different. That's enough for tonight." Ronan was quiet. The way he went quiet when he had nothing to argue with, which she was coming to recognize as different from the quiet of thinking or the quiet of withholding. "Your father would have liked this," he said. "Tonight." Clara looked out at the valley. The bruised purple sky, the long grass, the creek she couldn't see but could feel the presence of. That reliable, stubborn water running through the dark, the same way it had run every season of her life. He would have been terrified, she said, and then he would have helped anyway. She felt the papers against her ribs one last time. That was his whole thing. Behind them, through the window of Voss's house, she could hear the voices. Still arguing, still working through it, the long and unglamorous business of people reckoning with what they'd let happen and what they were going to do about it now. It was not a comfortable sound, but it was a real one, and in the morning, the work would continue. The territorial marshal arrived on the 6th day. His name was Aldous Reeves, a lean, sun-darkened man in his late 50s who rode with 2 deputies and carried himself with the particular economy of movement that comes from decades of arriving in places where things have already gone wrong. He read the papers in Drummond's kitchen, all 7 pages, twice through, and then he sat for a long moment with his hands flat on the table the way Drummond had done, that same gesture of a person steadying themselves against information. "Who gathered these?" he asked. "My father," Clara said. "Originally. He died before he could do anything with them." Reeves looked at her. He had the kind of face that gave very little away, but something in his eyes shifted slightly. Not sympathy exactly, more like the acknowledgement of a cost he understood. "And the signatures on the witness document? 7 Valley residents, all with properties named in the acquisition list. The compact officers, Geary and Marsh, where are they now?" "Black Ridge," Ronan said from the doorway. "Geary hasn't left his house since Saturday. Marsh rode out Monday morning heading east. Your deputies might want to know that." Reeves looked at Ronan for a moment. The way people always looked at Ronan, that initial assessing pause. "Creed," he said. "Marshall. Been a while since you were in this territory?" 12 years, roughly." "You staying?" A beat. Clara did not look at Ronan, kept her eyes on Reeves. "Haven't decided yet," Ronan said. Reeves accepted this without comment and turned back to the papers. He spent another hour at Drummond's table, asking precise questions and writing precise notes in a small leather book. And when he was done, he put his pen away and said, "I'm going to need Voss held available. Not arrested, not yet. I don't have enough for a clean arrest that won't get thrown at the territorial level, but I need him here and not moving papers or people around." "He's been at his ranch," Clara said. He hasn't moved since Saturday." "Because he's waiting for his own lawyer," Reeves said. "Which means I've got maybe 2 days before this gets complicated." He looked at Clara steadily. "You understand that what happens from here is a legal process. It's going to take time. It's going to be contested." "I know that. Some of what's in these papers is going to be hard to prove. The payment records. Geary and Marsh will have explanations prepared. Voss will have explanations prepared. It'll come down to a lot of things that have nothing to do with what's obviously true." "I know," Clara said again. Reeves looked at her for a moment longer. "Your father's been dead how long?" "A month and 3 days." He nodded once, slowly. "These papers kept," he said, "through everything. That's something." It was the closest thing to a compliment she was going to get from a man like Reeves, and she received it accordingly. What followed was not swift or clean, and Clara had prepared herself for that, but preparation and experience are different things, and she learned the difference in the weeks that came after. Voss's lawyer arrived from the territorial capital on the 3rd day, a different one than the man who'd been at the gathering, this one older, more expensive, with the settled confidence of someone who has made careers out of complicated situations. He filed 3 separate motions in the first week. 2 were dismissed. The 3rd was not, and it delayed the formal proceeding by 19 days, and those 19 days were some of the hardest Clara had spent since her father died. Because during those 19 days she had no legal standing. The Whitmore property was still technically in the syndicate's possession. She was living in the line camp, then in the Belmont sisters' spare room when the mountain nights got cold, and she was watching everything she'd built toward hang in a balance that someone else was holding, and there was nothing to do but wait and keep showing up. She showed up. Every day that the process required her presence, she was there. Every document that needed a signature, every deposition that needed her account, every meeting with Reeves where he laid out what was working and what wasn't with the flat honesty of a man who doesn't soften things. She sat through all of it in her dead mother's blue dress, which she'd washed and mended and continued wearing because she didn't have much else. And she answered every question as accurately as she could, and she did not embellish, and she did not perform, and she did not let herself think too far ahead to the outcome. It was Geary who broke first. On the 22nd day, he walked into Reeves's temporary office above the Black Ridge post office, alone, without his lawyer, carrying a folded paper in his hand, and asked to make a statement. Reeves sent for Clara. She sat in the corner and listened while Geary, a man she'd known her whole life, a man who'd attended her parents' wedding and shaken her father's hand at every compact session for 2 decades, told the truth about what he'd done and who had paid him to do it and for how long. It took 40 minutes. Geary did not look at Clara once during the 40 minutes, and she did not make him. She just listened. When it was done, and Geary had signed the statement and been escorted to a room to wait, Reeves looked at Clara and said, "That's the piece we needed." She nodded. "You doing all right?" he asked. It was the only personal question he'd asked her in 3 weeks, and it was asked with the same plain efficiency as all his professional ones. "Not particularly," she said. "But I'm here." "Yeah," he said. "I noticed." Voss was formally charged 17 days later. The charges covered fraudulent debt acquisition, conspiracy to defraud, and bribery of public compact officers. The buyer from Caldwell, Whitfield, had, as Clara predicted, retained his own counsel immediately after the gathering and had spent the intervening weeks working out a cooperation arrangement that would protect his business interests in exchange for documented testimony about the acquisition transactions. He was not a sympathetic figure, but he was a useful one, and usefulness was what the case needed more than sympathy. Marsh, the younger compact officer who had ridden east, was found in a town 2 days' ride away, having apparently lost his nerve for running about 40 miles into it. He came back voluntarily, which Reeves said counted for something in how the territorial court would see him, though not as much as Marsh seemed to hope. Kern left the territory. Nobody stopped him, and nobody went looking, which Clara thought said something about the judgment of the people managing this process, but she understood the logic. Kern was a hired hand, not a principal. The case was about Voss and the compact and the documents, not about the men Voss had used to enforce his will, and chasing Kern into whatever territory he'd ridden into would have cost more than it returned. She didn't like it. She thought about Will Callow's wrapped arm and Nessa's dry, fixed eyes and the black ruin of a house that a young family had built on 20 acres of bottomland, and she didn't like it. But she'd made her peace mostly with the distance between what was just and what was achievable, which is a peace that nobody reaches easily, and that doesn't stay made without continuous effort. 6 weeks after the territorial marshal arrived, the syndicate's claims on the 11 Valley properties were invalidated by formal order. The compact's debt reclamation proceedings against all named families were voided. The Whitmore property, 43 acres with a creek that never quite dried up, was returned to Clara by a document that took 40 seconds to sign and that she signed in the same office where she'd watched Geary make his statement, with Reeves as witness and Drummond standing in the corner because he'd asked to be there, and she'd said yes. She held the deed for a moment after the ink dried. It was a piece of paper, rectangular, slightly stiff, with official stamps and formal language describing the property in terms of compass bearings and boundary markers. It did not capture 43 acres of grass and rock and the particular sound the creek made in spring when the snowmelt was running. It did not capture 20 years of her father's stubborn effort, or the smell of the barn in the mornings, or the kitchen garden her mother had planted that Clara had kept going long past the point where it was practical. But it was real, and it was hers, and she folded it carefully and put it inside her dress next to her heart, which was where she'd carried the 7 pages that started all of this, and she thought, "There, Papa. There it is." She didn't cry. She'd been expecting to, and she didn't. She just felt the weight of the paper against her ribs and breathed, and that was enough. The Callow place took longer. The structure was gone. There was no rebuilding a burned house overnight. But the land was theirs again, clean and clear, and the valley organized around that in the way that valleys sometimes do when fear has been removed from the center of things, and something else rushes in to fill the space. Hatcher showed up with lumber from his own supply without being asked. The Belmont sisters came with a wagon full of tools and food, and Dora Belmont, who had turned out to have strong opinions about post-hole placement, directed 2 days of framing work with an authority that surprised everyone except Clara. Drummond came with his draft horse and spent 3 days doing the kind of labor that men his age are not supposed to do anymore, and that he did anyway, moving slowly and steadily and refusing offers of rest with the particular stubbornness of a man who has something to make up for and intends to do it in specific terms. Pettiford came on the second day. He didn't say much, which was in keeping with how he'd handled most of this. He just showed up and worked, and when Will Callow came over and stood next to him at the end of the afternoon, the two men were quiet together for a while. And then Will said something Clara couldn't hear, and Pettiford nodded once. And that was how some things are settled. Not with speeches, not with formal accounting, but with two people standing next to each other at the end of a hard day deciding that the next day can start differently. Clara watched this from across the work site and thought about the nature of communities, how they fracture and how they hold, how the same people who watch in silence can be the people who show up with lumber, how fear and decency can exist in the same person, and which one wins on any given day depends on factors that are hard to predict and impossible to control. She had been angry at these people. She was still, a little, in the places she didn't examine much. But she'd also been one of them once, in smaller ways. Had looked away from things that were easier to look away from. Had told herself that things that were not immediately her problem were not her problem. Nobody is only one thing. That was the conclusion, if she was being honest about it. Not a comfortable conclusion, not the kind that makes a satisfying verdict, but true. Voss went to the territorial court in October. Clara made the 3-day journey to testify, which she did for 4 hours over 2 days, answering questions from the prosecution, then from Voss's lawyer, who was thorough and skilled, and who did, as Reeves had predicted, work every angle of document provenance and chain of custody and the question of her father's means of obtaining the papers. She answered everything calmly and accurately. And when Voss's lawyer tried to frame her as a grieving daughter with a motive for fabrication, she looked at him and said, "The papers say what they say. I didn't write them. Voss did." The lawyer moved on. Voss was convicted on 2 of the 3 charges. The bribery charge was the cleanest. Geary's statement, Marcia's corroboration, and the payment records in the ledger pages gave the court what it needed. The fraudulent acquisition charge went through on 9 of the 11 properties and was contested on 2, which his lawyer managed to complicate enough that the verdict was split. The conspiracy charge was reduced at sentencing. It was not everything. Clara sat in the courtroom and heard the verdict and felt the mixed, uncomfortable weight of a partial outcome. The relief of the thing being done, the frustration of the parts that went sideways, the general sense that justice and satisfaction are related but not the same thing, and that anyone who expects them to be identical is going to spend a lot of their life disappointed. Voss was sentenced to 5 years at the territorial facility. His properties and assets were subject to a civil forfeiture proceeding that would take another 8 months to fully work through, and by the time it was done, the Black Ridge Land Compact had been dissolved by order of the territorial governor and reconstituted under new officers. People Reeves had vetted personally, which was not a guarantee of anything, but was better than nothing. Geary received a suspended sentence and was barred from holding public office for life. Marsh received a fine and 2 years probation. The lawyer from the Capitol lost his territorial practice license. None of it brought Edmund Whitmore back. None of it rebuilt the Callow house faster or gave back the weeks of sleep that the Belmont girls had lost or undid the years of slow squeezing that had worn the Valley families down to the specific kind of tired that gets into people when they've been afraid for too long. Justice doesn't reverse things. It just establishes, for the record, that certain things were wrong and certain people were responsible, and that the community, through whatever imperfect machinery it has available, has decided to say so formally. Clara understood this, and it was enough. She was home by late October. The Whitmore place needed work. Months of it, probably, before it was running the way it should. The fall harvest had been whatever she and the neighbors could manage in the chaos of the proceedings, which was not much. The barn needed a new section of roof. The creek pasture fence had 3 broken posts. The kitchen garden was past saving for this season, but would come back in spring if she got the soil turned before the first hard freeze, which was maybe 3 weeks away. She stood in the yard of her property on a clear, cold morning and looked at all of it. The work and the disrepair and the particular beauty of land that is yours in the full and legal and finally confirmed sense of the word. And she felt, underneath the tiredness and the long months of wait, something that was not exactly happiness, but was related to it. the solider thing underneath happiness, the thing that doesn't go away when the circumstances shift. She was still standing there when she heard a horse on the approach road. She knew the sound of the roan before she turned around. Ronan had been in and out of the valley through the fall, present when the proceedings needed him, absent for stretches that Clara had not asked to account for, doing whatever Ronan Creed did in the spaces between the things that brought him to places. She'd gotten used to the rhythm of it, or had told herself she had, which is not quite the same thing. He dismounted at the gate and came through and stopped a few feet from her. He looked at the property, took it in the way he took in most things, methodically, without performing the looking. "Roof needs work," he said. "I know. Fence posts on the south pasture. I know that too. Creek's running good." He paused. "I checked it this morning." She looked at him. "This morning? So you've been here since this morning?" "Got in last night." He met her eyes, and there was something in his that was more direct than usual. The careful distance he kept in his expression had moved back slightly. Not gone, but moved. "I wasn't sure whether to come to the house." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the thinking kind of quiet, or the withholding kind. She knew those both well enough by now. This was the kind that comes before saying something that can't be unsaid, which is different from the others. "I've been in a lot of places," he said. "That's not a brag, it's the shape of things. I stay until the thing is done, and then I go, and the going has always been easy. I've never had to talk myself into it." He looked at her steadily. "I had to talk myself into it this time, more than once." Clara held his gaze. The cold morning air moved between them, and somewhere in the south pasture the horses were moving, and the creek was running the way the creek ran every season of her life, regardless of what was happening to the people beside it. "So don't go," she said. He blinked, like the simplicity of it had surprised him. "It's not simple," he said. "It doesn't have to be simple," Clara said. "The roof needs work. The fence posts need replacing. The soil needs turning in the kitchen garden before the freeze." She looked at him directly. "I'm not asking for simple. I'm asking if you want to stay." He looked at her. This woman who had stood on a platform in a dead mother's dress and refused to beg, who had carried 7 pages of evidence against her ribs for 3 weeks, and then walked into a room full of hostile witnesses and laid them on a table, who had ridden through a valley full of frightened people and asked them plainly to be unafraid, who had sat in a courtroom and listened to a partial verdict and received it without falling apart. "Yeah," he said. "I want to stay." She nodded, turned back to look at the property. He came and stood beside her, and they both looked at the work ahead. The broken things, the needed things, all the ordinary labor of a place that is alive and requires effort to keep that way. It was not a romantic moment in any of the ways that people usually mean by that word. It was 2 people standing side by side in a cold October morning, deciding to start something that would be difficult and unglamorous and real. The kind of thing that gets built slowly, out of days, the way everything worth having gets built. Clara thought about her father, about the way he'd pressed those papers into her hands and trusted her with something he could no longer carry. She thought about Drummond looking up from his boots, about Dora Belmont directing framing work with her hands on her hips, about Nessa Callow's dry eyes that had eventually, slowly, found their way back to something else, about Pettiford and Will standing at the end of a hard day, deciding the next one could be different, about all the ordinary, imperfect, difficult ways that people turn toward each other when they finally decide that fear is not somewhere to live permanently. The thing about courage is that nobody feels it from the inside the way it looks from the outside. From the inside, it feels like being tired and scared and doing the thing anyway because the alternative is something you can't stand to be. It's not a warm feeling. It's not particularly noble in the moment. It's mostly just the grinding work of staying upright when staying upright is hard, and then getting up the next morning and doing it again. Clara had learned this in the months behind her and expected she would keep learning it in the months ahead, which stretched out in front of her now like the valley, in the morning light, wide and full of work and hers. She went to start on the fence post. Ronan got the tools from the barn without being asked, and they worked through the morning in the particular companionable quiet of 2 people who have been through something real together and don't need to fill the silence. And the creek ran through the lower pasture the way it always had, steady and stubborn, and not going anywhere. And Black Ridge Valley moved into its winter with the particular feeling of a place that has reckoned with itself and come out the other side not fixed, not perfect, but honest, and ready, for the first time in a long time, to simply be.